Prior to the bloody race riots in Chicago of 1919, aka Red Summer, in the year 1970, 38 blacks had been lynched and another 38 died in race riots in East St. Louis. In 1918, 58 blacks were lynched. Over the year 1919 as a whole, 26 race riots in total took place. Let's take a journey on life before the bloody race riots.
The 1919 race riots have left a significant mark on Chicago's psyche. It's still something that we talk about all the time.
In 1919, Chicago was just one place in a world being reshaped by war and immigration. But that global turmoil provided the backdrop to a local eruption of violence. It was violence sparked right here, the shores of Lake Michigan, on July 27, 1919. And nearly 100 years later, the landscape may have changed, but the scars left behind have not. In 1919, troops were coming home from World War I. But those troops were also returning during the largest immigration waves in U.S. history. From 1900 to 1920, the population of America increased by nearly 40%. That made for a fierce competition for jobs, like at the stockyards of South Chicago.
Well, the stockyards with a couple of other major industries in Chicago were one of the gigantic employers, employing several thousand people. Most of them by that time, by 1919, were Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Also, within the last 5 years, African Americans were coming from places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana to northern cities. Mississippians were especially coming to Chicago on the Illinois Central Railroad to get jobs in meatpacking, also in steel, also in the railroads. So you had a bit of sort of forced integration. Sometimes African Americans would also come in to the industry as scabs, as replacement workers. So not only were there these racial tensions, but on top of that, often there were labor tensions that would be created in a place like the meatpacking industry on the South Side.
The bloody race riots took place following the steadily growing tensions of the migration of African Americans from the rural South to the North. During this time, the KKK revived their violent acts, and a total of 64 lynchings took place in 1918 and 83 in 1919. Let's listen further on what happened on that summer day in 1919 that led to what we now call the bloody race riots.
With those racial and social tensions in the background, a day at the beach ignited a week of intense fighting that left dozens dead and entire neighborhoods burnt.
July 27, 1919, a teenage African-American man by the name of Eugene Williams, who could not swim, was in a bit of a makeshift raft. And he was out on Lake Michigan, and he departed from the 29th Street beach. And this is an era we think of the South as being segregated. Well, in Chicago, none of this was enforced by law, but it was enforced by custom. So there were strict dividing lines between the 26th Street beach, which was for whites, and the 29th Street beach, which was supposed to be for African Americans. Eugene Williams' raft drifted over close enough to 26th Street beach, that is the white beach. People started to notice that basically he was desegregating the water, if that's possible. And some people threw rocks at him. He was eventually hit in the head, and he was still in the water. More rocks were thrown at him, and he eventually drowned. What some African-American beachgoers tried to do was to appeal to, of course, at that time, an all-white Chicago police force. Basically, they got no response. There were no efforts to arrest the whites who threw the rocks. And in fact, as the riots went on, starting with July 27th, went on from there, the police were either non-responsive or, in fact, responsive against the African-American communities of the South Side.
Mobs of mostly young white men terrorized African-American neighborhoods, but violence broke out in all parts of the city.
you see a lot of young people, especially Southsiders, whites, who were getting involved in not just violence, but looting and burning and those kinds of things that we associate with riots in the 21st century.
After the riots concluded, there were calls for segregation from local, state, and national sources. City Council favored the separation of the races and wanted an investigation to be launched to identify the cause of the riot. According to Charles Tilley, the author of The Politics of Collective Violence, us-them boundaries are crucial in examining the cause behind the Bloody Race Riots. The Bloody Race Riots took place because the whites and the blacks had a fine line drawn on what part of the beach belonged to who. The whites, who I assume would be the us, and the blacks, who took on the them, were already experiencing enough racial tension with the segregation that was going on in Chicago. When Eugene crossed that line, he only added fuel to the already burning fire. It's important to define these boundaries because there's always a constant struggle between the two, and without definition, it would only lead to more problems. In conclusion, the Bloody Race Riots devastated the whole community of Chicago, both physically and mentally, the majority of the devastation being on the black community. Looking at all the violence that took place because of injustice reminds me of the injustice in today's world. We watch unarmed African Americans being killed left and right by police officers with no punishments following their actions. So I ask the question, will African Americans ever have justice?